Welcome to the Damn Strong podcast. I'm your host, Bree, and I'm a full-time online fitness coach, and my passion is to educate women on all things fitness. I help women just like you step into the power of knowledge and commitment to ultimately live your best and strongest life. In this podcast, we'll talk about being damn strong in our body, mind, and life. I'll be teaching you how to navigate nutrition, strength training, and mindset challenges. So get ready to take some notes because we're building a damn strong life. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I wanted to do a quick intro today since I have a guest on, just giving you guys a little background on what this episode is going to be all about. Today, I have Ruth on the podcast, and I'm so excited to have her on just because we've known each other for so long, and she's also just a wealth of knowledge, especially when it comes to training. I mean, honestly, she's a wealth of knowledge in everything. I need to have her back on the pod to talk about nutrition, but her passion is training and optimizing that and teaching women how to train effectively and not wasting time in the gym. So I really wanted to have her on the podcast today, giving her tips and all the information on training and how to optimize that for yourself, whether you're a beginner or advanced, and just kind of giving a history and a little background on her and where she came from and how she started her training. And, we've all had a day one. So in this specific episode, we're going to dive in heavily into training. So I hope you guys are excited to listen and enjoy. All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. I have a guest today, which I am so excited about. This is Ruth. I didn't ask before we got on this. How do you pronounce your last name correctly?
Maleski.
Okay, that's what I was going to say, but I would hate to butcher that. So also known as Ruth_Empower on Instagram. I feel like we've been following each other for a really long time. Ruth is someone, I said this before we got on, that we're very, very similar in a lot of things that we do. We're both very strength-based and science-based. And, if you follow Ruth or you check out her page, she is very much about showing you the optimal way to do things, the best ways to do something, so you're not wasting time, whether that's nutrition, which we could dive into at some point, but mostly training. I think a big part of your passion is training. You love that aspect of teaching people that, and that's your biggest, I think, enjoyment of your learning as well. So with all that to say, why don't you give everyone kind of like an intro about you, who you are, what you do? Maybe start with that, and then maybe we'll go into background after that.
Okay, love it. Well, thank you so much, Bree. I'm really excited to be here. And like you said, we've been talking in the DMs for quite some time now. I don't even know how long.
Yeah.
So it's really fun to be chatting face to face. And I feel like, so you're right, we're very, very similar in our coaching approach, which is one connection I had with you. But then I also feel like we have this thing where we'll look at each other's stories, and I feel like I do this with you anyways. I'll be like, oh, wait, I love that haircut. I'm going to do that too. Or oh, wait.
All the time.
Yes, all the time.
All the time.
Inspo, so I feel like we just have a lot in common.
We do. Well, even if we get into your background a little bit, you were homeschooled, I was homeschooled. Yes. There's just so many little things of similarities, but you're right. There's so many times where she'll be like, okay, what did you ask her for your haircut? I'm like, okay, what pants are these? And we're very similar on style and all that kind of stuff. And we're always DMing back and forth for that kind of stuff.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love it. So yes, that really, the homeschool connection, I forgot about that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell everyone what you do, who you are, what your thing, and then we'll dive into a little bit of your history and talk about all the things that we relate on.
For sure. Yes. So again, my name's Ruth. I live in Minnesota with my husband. We just got our first snow. We were talking about that before coming on. I am a fitness and nutrition coach. I have been in the industry for about, I believe we're coming up on 8 years now. Wow. I was certified, in 2015. I worked in gyms for the first about 5 years of my career, which was a great experience. And then I transitioned to fully online in 2020. The perfect time to do it.
Yes, it was.
And yes, yeah. And so since then which has been, which is crazy. We're coming up on almost 3 full, or I guess almost 4. Almost 4, right? Yeah. Years since then, which is insane. I've been absolutely loving it. From the beginning, going online was a huge goal, but I wanted that in-person experience first. And I'm so grateful that I did go that route. I think that it really developed my coaching skills in a way that if I had just immediately started online, not like people can't. I think people certainly can,
Right.
and they can do it in the correct way. But I'm glad that I went that route. So
Yeah.
yeah, I grew up on. Oh, did you want to ask a question?
No,
Sorry.
I was going to say you have a different experience or an edge that other people don't of that in-person training, because in-person training is so different than online. So I was just going to reiterate that as you were
Yeah.
talking about that. So
No, totally. Yes, you get really good at responding to people's problems and like problem solving essentially, which is
yeah,
what you do as a coach anyways.
yeah,
Um, but I feel like in person, there's just that other extra element and getting good at like the human connection and that kind of thing as well.
totally.
Yeah. But I grew up on a farm, like big family, homeschool family, like three.
Woo!
And so very much like I tell people who have a hard time visualizing it, I'm like, think like Laura Ingalls Wilder essentially, but
Yeah.
like a little bit later than that, you
Right.
know? But honestly, like my especially younger years lived on a lot of acreage, just a lot of like running through the woods, enjoying life.
Yeah.
I never was in any sports or anything like that. We were more into, or I was more into like speech and debate and that whole sphere growing
I
up.
can so see that. Just like what I know of your personality, that does not surprise me at all. So I love that.
Oh, it's too funny. And yeah, so always like very active growing up, but never in any sort of organized fashion.
Right.
And so in high school, I got into running. And I think the thing that initially got me into running was not truly like, I'm so grateful for this, but my early years were not shaped around a lot of food or exercise focus. And I think that was so healthy, and I'm grateful for that. And that's something that that I'm grateful to just my family environment and parents for. But I think I'm trying to think. So when I initially got interested in running, it wasn't like, oh, I need to be tiny or, oh, like I really need to be small. It was more so my sister-in-law, or she was marrying into the family. She was into running. And it was like, oh, running seems cool. Like she's cool. I like running too. So
yeah.
I started,
so cute.
I know, right? So I started getting into running a little bit, and I never liked running, but it was what I had access to. And this is why to this day I never bash running, because even though like now very much like strength training, weightlifting, that's what I love, that's what I teach, that's what I coach. And I think, we agree on this too, Brie, but that's what, if we want to change body composition, like that's the vehicle, that's the thing. But I think that people can love running as a sport, as something of interest. There's so many cool avenues with it. And something that I think is not talked about enough is it's such a good intro into the fitness world, because you need no equipment, right? Yeah, no equipment. All you need is like a decent pair of running shoes, and you barely even need that. Like you can technically go barefoot.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you need nothing. So it's such a good intro into the world of showing up for yourself and being healthy and doing the fitnessy things, whatever. So that's what it was for me. It was an intro into that. And then eventually through that, I started getting interested in weightlifting in college. My husband actually was the first one who like brought me into a weight room in college.
Way.
Walked me around and like literally took me to each piece of equipment and was like, "Here, sit down here. I'll show you how to do this." And I was
sweet.
Right? Yeah, so cute.
What got you even to like? How did he even take you to the gym? Like, how did that transition even happen? Do you know?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I think back when I was kind of into the running and whatnot, I started doing like some circuit training in my parents' basement. Because again, very low barrier to entry. All you need is like, well, a lot of that you need nothing as well.
Right. Yeah.
But maybe a couple pairs of dumbbells. So I had kind of like picked up some weights a little bit in my parents' basement. I liked that better. I liked that better than running. I was like, ooh, I really like this.
Yeah.
And then we did this like fundraising run in college where we ran across the state of Minnesota and we were fundraising for this cause.
Oh, wow.
And within that, I was running a lot, but I was also like, I started doing more weightlifting to try and supplement. And I think that's what got me initially into the college.
Okay.
I think it was like, he was like, hey, we should do some weightlifting too. Cause we were doing this like event together.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, like, let's do it.
Yeah.
No, seriously though, if it hadn't been for him, if it hadn't been for some sort of an outside source, I think being like, I'll go with you. I'll go with you.
Yeah.
It, which is so huge. Like as a coach, that's what we do for clients too. Right? Like, let me show you how to do it.
Yeah.
So loved that. Like There's definitely some like confidence that needed to be built in terms of being confident in the gym, but I did love weightlifting out of the gate. And that was through that process, like during that time period of initially being introduced into the gym and doing that fundraising run, that's where I decided I think I want to do this like as a career. And so I got my
Wow.
yeah, so I got my personal training certification. Prior to that, I was in school for music.
Okay, that's what I was about to ask. I was like, how did you go? Because I was assuming you didn't even go to college with the intent of doing this. Like, it's so crazy. It was that small of a moment that you're like, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. It wasn't this 10-year build on whatever. It was a very small moment where you're like, this. I love this. This is
I love it.
amazing. That's
Yeah,
cool.
exactly. So I got certified. Through the certification process, I decided, yeah, I'm quitting the music degree. So, because I was like, I'll test it. You know, the certification process isn't that thing. I'll do that. I'll see if I like it. And then, yeah, I started working in gyms in 2016, I believe. I got my first job at an Anytime Fitness.
Oh my gosh.
I
That's
had
cool.
I had like 2 clients, and I taught senior group classes. That was my intro.
Oh, I would love to teach senior. I bet that was the most precious class to teach.
To this day, it's like one of my favorite things I've ever done in person. Like
Yeah,
it was
it would be for mine too.
so fun. Yeah, I loved them, and they loved me, and it was just like, oh yeah.
So did you drop your music? Like, did you just drop completely out of college and go, okay, I'm gonna get certified and then start training, or did you finish out college with a different degree?
So I was going for a bachelor's in music, and
Okay.
so I'd already done a bunch of
Associate.
generals. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd done
Okay.
some music classes. I want to say I was about a year in.
Okay.
I think it was about a year in when I made that transition. Yeah.
Okay.
And so at that point, I was like, well, I have all of these credits already. I should do something with it. So
Yeah.
I just got an associate's degree.
Hey, but good for you. There's so many people that just are like, I have to follow through and finish this. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But
Exactly.
I think, I don't know if at the time you recognize, but you could always go back. You have all of these credits already under you. If you don't like this, you could go back and pursue music. So it's just very like at such a young age, very, I don't know if that's how you thought it through, but very forward thinking of just being like, it's okay. Like, let me pursue this. This is what I want to do. And I always can come back to school.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Well, I don't think I did think that, but that's
Okay.
a good
Yeah.
I think mostly I was like, I was not loving the music stuff anyways. I did it because it's something I knew. Like I did piano lessons ever since I was.
Well, and what you're not telling people is you had a family band.
Yeah.
For those of you guys who don't know or follow Ruth and don't know this, her family had a full on band. So they were musical everything.
Which is precisely why I was like, well, I've got to do music.
Yeah. Which makes sense. Yeah.
But the funny thing is and I know we're rabbit trailing, but the funny thing is with a family band is if the family decides or whoever of the kids decide, hey, we're going to do a family band, there are people with varying levels of talent.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you.
I was certainly not at the top of the I wasn't at the bottom. Well, I don't know. Yeah, no, I wasn't at that. I would say I was like, I'm decently talented in music. I've got a bit of an ear, but I had a couple of siblings who like, they still do music to this day.
Yeah.
Like,
that makes sense.
They were really good. Yeah.
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 I mean, the likelihood that, how many siblings do you have? Like 6?
Yeah.
7. The likelihood of all 7 kids wanting to do music is just unlikely anyways, but I just had to point that out because I remember when you shared that in your stories, I was like, no freaking way. This is amazing. Like, and like we've said earlier, I'll get us back on track, but just like with our homeschool, like together background, I did co-ops and stuff. So I wasn't a true home, but I was around a lot of the kids who grew up completely homeschooled. And so, having the van or 7 kids or wearing the denim skirts and having the family band, like it was just such a thing. And so I think you posted that and I was like, don't tell me you did this, 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 and this. And you're like, oh my gosh, yes, I did. And so you're like, how do you know this? I'm like, I was homeschooled too. So,
and that's the thing. It was like, as you started saying it, I'm like, no way. Cause that's, you only know.
Only know that if you're in it. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll segue back into all of this, but I still want everyone to hear that history. Well, actually, I do want to ask you one more question about that. And then we'll segue into the next part is, do you feel like, this was my initial thought when you said this, you were like, growing up when I was younger, I didn't have that influence of like trying to be the smallest version of me and exercise and the food stuff, like that all wasn't. It was more so you grew up on the farm, you ate really great foods, assuming. Do you feel like you being homeschooled attributed to that because you didn't have the outside influences of other kids? Because there wasn't social media at the time. Do you think that was a big part of it? Or do you feel like, no, I was at church and I had small group, I had all these things and I totally had it, and I had a really good family support? Do you feel like you being home, like at homeschooled, had an influence on that for you?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I think that, so we did co-ops and like we were pretty
Okay.
social as well. We did
Okay,
co-ops,
cool.
church, we did competitive speech in debate that we would travel like all over the place for.
Okay.
Lots of interaction with other kids and like other families and other people for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That being said, I don't remember running into that with my friends.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't think in the friend groups that I ran in, I think they were mostly other homeschool kids
Yeah.
that were also fairly sheltered, you know, a lot of maybe similar upbringing, if you will.
Yeah.
I don't think that I ran into it. And I didn't have social media until I think I was like 20 years old before I had Instagram. Like,
hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
no, well, honestly, I'm so grateful now. I'm like,
Yeah.
if I had social media earlier, I think that's where a lot of it comes out. Don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Yeah.
so much.
When I look back at mine, I definitely think my parents were a big influence on how I viewed myself. My mom was always trying to be smaller, always making comments about how her body looked and stuff. So that definitely played a part. And then you get into, I was in like a regular school, middle school and stuff. And you look at the magazines and all these things with your friends, and they're trying to do that. And you're watching, like, I don't know what your movie, because I again, understanding from a homeschool background, I don't know what movies you were allowed to be exposed to, but you see like Hilary Duff and like Amanda Bynes, like all these people, and you're trying to aspire to be them. And then social media, though, I think about, because I think I got onto MySpace back in like 20 in middle school. And so a lot of that influence came that, because you see these pictures of these girls and people are complimenting them and all these things. So I definitely do think social media, I think it really helped that you weren't on it till later in life, when you were probably, 20 is still really young, but you're more sure of yourself as a person. And so I'm sure that had an influence as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So.
And thankfully, like, I didn't struggle with that in middle school, high school, as a, super, super young person.
Right.
I did go through, like, once I started, actually, this is crazy, but once I started working in the fitness world is I went through a period of struggling with my relationship with food, like wanting to be smaller and smaller, all of that. And it was because of, again, I got social media. I was in an environment that was unfortunately not very healthy and really promoted a lot of unhealthy dieting and just a very like non-educational view of fitness and nutrition. And so I did eventually, unfortunately, have a period of that where I did really struggle. But thankfully, it wasn't when I was super young. And I think that doesn't mean like it wasn't still a struggle, but I am really grateful for that, because I think that there is something to be said of like, I've been struggling with this since I was, 10 years old. Like, thankfully, and again, like, regardless of if that's someone's story, there's always hope and there's always moving forward from that. But that's not
totally. I like that you point out, you're like, I'm not, just because I didn't experience it in my youth doesn't mean that I didn't experience at some point, because you're in an industry that how you look is so, and even if it's not from another personal trainer, people are commenting on your stuff. Well, you don't look like you'd be a personal trainer. You don't look like you work out, or things like that. And you're just like, oh, okay, like I'm getting it from outside even my own industry now, kind of thing. And so you can still experience that. So, okay, we'll go ahead and transition and talking about training stuff. I first want to talk through, so when you first started strength training, what did that look like? What did your routine look like? How'd you first start? And then we'll transition to, okay, like, how has that changed now? But just kind of run me through, like, when you walked into that gym for the first time, what were your workouts like for the next few years, and how were they structured?
Yeah. So when I walked into that gym for the first time, like the thing that my husband Jesse was kind of showing me was I would say kind of like a typical bro approach, a little bit of like 10 to 12 reps, rest 60 seconds, 3 to 4 sets, that kind of thing, which is perfectly fine. On my own end, though, when I started getting introduced into the fitness world and getting jobs and like starting my career, I actually was the gyms that I was in and where I was working was very group fitness um,
Mm.
focused. Yes. So I was still doing weightlifting and I would still like go to the gym. I would even like go to different gyms from like the gym that I worked out at
Yeah.
or I'm sorry, the gym that I trained at, right? Because that was more like the big, like a big room, some free weights. Everyone goes from station to station, that kind of thing. So I would work out in those classes a couple times a week, but then I'd also go to the gym on my own, maybe
Yeah.
3 times per week and try to do more of like a lifting approach. That being said, I can see how I was very, very influenced by the group training atmosphere because I would still do like timed, like 45 seconds between sets. I can't
Yeah.
remember. I think that I did that for the first several years. I would never have rested more than 45 seconds between
Yep.
sets, which
Yep.
makes me want to barf right now. So a lot of that, a lot of like on the higher rep range, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of like 15 to 30 reps, which again, this is not me bashing. This is just me kind of telling my
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
So a lot on the more like metabolic end, for sure. A lot of more metabolic stuff, even though in my mind, I was like, oh, this is the heavy lifting, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
When I did finally start to transition to progressive overload and longer rest periods and that kind of thing, I was blown away at how much I could lift. Like, oh my
Yeah.
God, right? Like when you actually give yourself sufficient rest, you suddenly are moving so much weight and you feel like so amazing about it,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, so that's kind of how it started. I think it had a lot of influence from that group training environment.
Okay, cool. And so what would you, I mean, and this is why I kind of told you in our questions, this is probably where we're going to rabbit trail off because I feel like
Yeah.
there's probably a lot of things that you would have changed, but from
Yeah.
when you take all the influence that you had with group training and doing the high rep and doing the, 45-second rest, I'm sure those few things we'll talk about. Like, what would you change from what you initially did then? Like, if you saw little Ruth, like in that gym doing the group stuff, and you walked up to her and you're like, okay, you need to fix that. Obviously, you'd say it very nicely, but hey, you need to fix this, 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 and this. Like, what are the things that you identify right away and be like, okay, big boulders, let's change these things. And then let's kind of work on these smaller things. Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, I
Okay.
love this question too. And I love how you kind of addressed it as like, what were the boulders? Because
Yeah.
I wouldn't have gone up to me and been like, so you're not doing RPE? You know what I mean?
Right.
I was way down the line. That was not
Right.
the most important thing.
Right.
So the first thing is, and this is actually kind of the progression that it took when I did start transitioning over as well. So that this is my
That's
experience
nice.
as well as
Yeah.
what I probably told myself is to repeat your workouts. don't
Mm,
don't do different workouts every single time, every single week that you're in the gym because the whole like shocking your body into change is not a
right.
thing.
Yep.
I was sure that that was right for a
Yep.
while. And I remember like being on the mic, in the group training gym, being like, all right, you guys, like I would even use that phrase, let's shock your body into change.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big one is start repeating your workouts. No,
Yeah.
it's and with that tracking them, start
Yeah.
tracking your weights, start
Yeah.
repeating and tracking. So essentially, implement progressive overload.
Yeah.
And when I did finally start to implement that, in I want to say that was like 2018, 2019, probably 2019 for real is when I was like, I'm gonna actually try this for real. I'm not gonna do 4 weeks of progressive overload, quote unquote, and then back to my what I was doing before. I'm going to try this for like 6 months. And so yeah, so that's the first thing is progressive overload. Repeat your workouts. Start tracking your training.
Yeah.
The next thing from there is intentional exercise selection. I would have overhauled and did eventually the exercises that I was choosing to do.
Yeah.
I was when I very first started out, very, very into like novelty. What's different? What looks cool? What's fun to do?
Yeah.
And I think that the fun piece is worth considering. It shouldn't be the top. It shouldn't be like, oh, we make a workout because it's fun. But I think that is an element worth considering. And that's
Right.
something that I take into consideration, like as a coach when I'm programming and whatnot. But it is definitely not the top.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be like what's going to look the coolest, what's going to be most novel, all of that.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of that. And when I started doing more basic movements, And of course, as I progressed in my career and started really delving into more of the evidence-based space, which again was about like that 2019 period and beyond, that's when I did start even perfecting those exercises. But at the very beginning, when I was just getting introduced into progressive overload, I didn't need to find the best bench press variation for the front delts. Like what I needed was just to start bench pressing,
Yeah, totally.
and repeat that for 4 to 6 weeks.
Yes.
And I don't know why I use bench press as an example because that's not, but
no,
whatever.
but there's so many different ways to like hit the shoulders in general. I know we're talking about like the front delts and stuff, but it's like you can get so nitpicky and people get so nitpicky. It's like, dude, just lift. You don't even lift consistently at this point. Like, let's be consistent. And then once we're consistent and then we can get more nitpicky with stuff. So I think that, I think bench was a great example because there's so many different variations that you can do.
Right. Exactly. And then from there, I would say once we're doing progressive overload, once we're doing that consistently, once we've kind of overhauled the exercise selection and we're now choosing more basic, strong movements, at that point, then we're talking, okay, now let's rest for longer than 45 seconds. Let's get sufficient rest. What's RPE? Let's start talking about intensity. How close are you working to failure? Let's start talking about total volume. Do you need to be in the gym for 6 days per week? No, you do not.
Right.
And so all of those things would be what I would address next. And again, like thankfully around that 2019 mark, I hired my first coach and she was a good coach.
Yeah.
And so Lindsay Parker, actually, I know we both
know her. Yeah.
Yes. And she was a good coach. And so she brought me through this process. And so kind of what I would tell a newbie or someone who's just getting into weightlifting is similar of how my journey looked as well.
What was your difference in, I'm just curious, you were saying you were doing certain exercises and you'd optimize those or make them better, do the basics. What were you doing before that you then changed? Like, I mean, I could probably guess a few because I'm sure I was doing them too, but do you have any off the top of your head where you're like, yeah, I was doing this and not a good choice?
So I was very into like combo movements for a while. And a lot of it had to do with some of the accounts that I was following on Instagram and information I was getting from trainers that I should have dug deeper. Like, why am I listening to this trainer? What's their background? Are they talking from any evidence or are they just saying things?
Right.
So a lot of combination stuffs like squat and press and curl and burpee and like whatever, a lot of that. So I couldn't even, and again, I was very into novelty for a time. So it was like, if no one's seen it, if my clients never heard of it, the better it is,
Yeah.
Which is too bad because
right.
opposite of what's true, right? And what's actually optimal for body composition change and all of that. But so I have this visual in my head of, so I was into combination movements. I was also very into like burpee variations for a while.
Dear Lord.
But I would be like, no, but I'm going to do a burpee, but with weights, or I'm going to do a burpee, but like over a bench or like with a bench.
Right.
And I have this visual in my mind because I feel like I still have a video of it somewhere on my phone because I come across it every once in a while. I was like 2 benches. I don't know if straddling is the right word. I was like 1 foot on 2 benches next to each other, 1 foot on each bench. Yes. And then jump down in the middle, do like a burpee in the middle of the 2 benches, and then like jump back up on the bench and do some sort of like squat jump from there. Oh, I cringe. I also am just grateful that like I didn't hurt myself real bad.
Yeah, that was my first thought. It's just like, oh my gosh, like the risk for injury and the movement that you were doing was so high.
Right.
For what benefit? For what benefit? Now you can jump off something now,
Absolutely. Yeah. And the funny, well, not funny, but again, the thing, I was in a gym where the age group was a lot older than me. Like at this point I was early 20s and the probably most of the women there were 30s, 40s, some 50s, like a lot of 30s, 40s, right? But a lot of like a good population of 50s and beyond as well. And so heaven forbid if I do the programming, thankfully we would always program some regressions and that stuff as well. But I think back and I'm like, man, oh, we live and we learn. We live and we learn, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then let's go. This is, I think, a perfect segue into the next part is I asked on this next question is like, what's your biggest pet peeve when you're looking at social media and see training stuff? And I do want to disclaim that if anyone's doing any of this kind of stuff that whatever she says, like as coaches, we don't judge you. You don't know any better. Just like Ruth has talked about in her journey, like she was doing the stuff. She didn't know any better. She's learned, she's educated herself. We all start somewhere. But is there stuff on social media, maybe coaches or influencers that you see them doing stuff and your blood boils watching it? Anything that you can name that comes to mind?
Yeah, so probably two biggest pet peeves. And again, this first one, I feel like I try and have a lot of empathy for because it is a lot of beginner coaches or people who don't know better.
Yeah.
And that is the whole novel exercise thing,
Yeah.
right? Of like, look at this new thing. It's going to torch your belly fat.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to shrink your legs. It's going to whatever. Just a lot of empty promises that have absolutely zero base in any reality or evidence or anything like that.
Right.
And bonus points if it's someone who is cute and has a good body. So everyone is now buying programs and investing in this ideology essentially through a person who doesn't necessarily know what they're talking about. And at the end of the day, the results that they got may or may not have even been from the stuff that they're showing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's a big one. It's just novel exercises, like that kind of thing. Like this, do this exercise. It's going to torch the what's the one? The under booty fat, like just random. Like what?
Or like this one exercise changed my glutes. And it's like, no, actually you just enjoyed it. And so you trained harder and then you actually were eating more and just all of those things too.
Precisely. Yeah,
totally.
That's one. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So the other one is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. And this one you said makes your blood boil. I don't think that first one makes my blood boil. It's just like, oh, it's kind of annoying. Yeah. And I want people I'm like, I hope that your followers somehow fall across like the evidence-based community at some point. That's great. This second one can make my blood boil a little. It's coach ego. Being someone who is my way or the highway, they see maybe those influencers who are doing the not so great exercises and promoting that kind of thing. And they'll kind of swing the opposite direction almost of like, you're dumb if you don't train this way. This is how you do it optimally. This is the way. This is how you do it. This is how you get gains. And it's like, you know what? I am super into finding out what's optimal and what's most efficient as well. But people have been building muscle for a very long time. Yes. And so like at the end of the day, to tell someone like, this is what you have to do in order to get a good physique or build muscle or whatever, it's just not true. People can do things that aren't optimal. And if they're working hard, they can still see great results. And so I think that it's good to pursue doing things optimally, but not at the expense of effort and just showing up. Like just consistency and effort, those two things get more results than optimal training ever did.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the other thing is I think that sometimes and I usually see this from, coaches essentially, but it tends to be ego and a lot of like black and white thinking. And I don't appreciate that.
How do you feel like you find that balance of like what's optimal, but also what's enjoyable, either in your client's training or your own, whichever you feel like is a better example? Because I feel like for a long time, like you said, you hired Lindsay, I hired Jordan, and Jordan taught me and walked me through a lot of things. And you guys have been through the same N1 education and all that. And so I think for a long time, I was on that route of like, and this was not Jordan, this was me, of like, oh my gosh, I have to do everything so optimal. And I was getting to a point where it's like, I wouldn't even let my clients deadlift. Not that I wouldn't let them, but I was getting to this point of like, deadlifting is not optimal. I don't advise you doing deadlift. And I was like, why am I doing this? Like I have a client who just really enjoys deadlifting. You can still build muscle while deadlifting. Sure, we can maybe argue some things of like why might not be optimal, but if they're pushing themselves and they're showing up and they're excited for their workouts, that actually is kind of optimal. So how do you find, that's a long route way of me saying, how do you find the balance for your own clients or yourself when it comes to optimal versus what's enjoyable, practical, all that stuff?
Yeah, yeah. I think it comes back to, like you said, like what's going to keep you consistent and showing up and allows for you to work hard. And the truth is, a lot of the optimal stuff needs to be layered. We can't just hit someone straight out of the gate. Again, like thinking back to me when I was initially starting really understanding and getting into weightlifting, if you had hit me with everything all at once, like you've got to do progressive overload, so now you have to repeat workouts and you never have before, and like you don't want to,
Yeah.
you have to like you got to stop doing all of the exercises you're doing right now, so you have to learn all new exercises.
Yeah.
And then like you also have to get your rests and your RPE and your like all of those things right. And then you also have to change like how many days you're going to the gym. If I'd been hit with all of it all at once, that would have been enough for me to be like, you know what, I'm actually not going to try this. I'm going to go back to what I was doing, to safe, to what I know, and to what I can actually show up and do consistently, And so I think again, I think consistency and effort have to be like two really high things that we keep in mind as coaches. What can keep our clients consistent, and what can they do well or well enough to get results, And then from there, layer things on, which is part of what a coaching process looks like,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think part of recognizing too, like what's practical optimal is kind of unique to everyone. Like I think you and me, we really love learning. We really love trying out new things. If I had a coach give me a whole program of new exercises, I would be so excited to be like, okay, let's figure out form. Let's figure out how to do this. Like that's exciting to me. But to someone else, that's not exciting. That's overwhelming. They have to figure out new machines. And so finding that balance can also be very individual for different people. And so to your point of like consistent in effort, find out where that balance is. If you are, and this is actually a great transition, our next part of like advice for beginners. And so I was going to add to that. It's like if you're going to the gym and you're intimidated by everything, but you're not intimidated by the machines, just use machines. Do your leg extension, leg curl, leg press, like just do something to go into that barrier. So I want you to answer that. What do you feel like is your biggest piece of advice for beginners, specifically for beginners for their strength training, whether that's getting started, they're currently in it and they're a beginner, however you feel like you want to answer that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's kind of been the theme, I think, of our whole conversation.
Yeah, I agree.
It's essentially like the steps we've been talking about, like let's layer things on. So the first one would be, again, consistency. What is going to make your training something that you want to show up for?
Yeah.
And of course, that's a whole rabbit trail of conversation of like, okay, even if you love your training, you're not always going to want to show up. So like that's a thing too. But I think that there is still value in doing something that you feel confident enough doing, or you like enough, that is going to keep you coming back.
Yeah.
And so again, like a brand new beginner, it might be if you give them a ton of exercises where they have all new setups and it's all like big equipment, maybe the equipment that they would categorize as scary or whatever, and then expect them to jump in and do that immediately, and then to be repetitive with that, it could be too overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where I think like even some of these classes that maybe aren't, well, they certainly aren't optimal or great for long-term body composition progress, they're a great way to get people in the door.
Yeah.
A great way to get people in the door. Same thing with running and circuit training and like, just body weight stuff. Let's just get you moving. So from someone who doesn't work out at all, what can get you moving and what can keep you showing up consistently?
Yeah.
So I think that's the first one, is what will you do consistently? The next one is, let's now kind of start exploring those exercises that we're doing. Make sure execution is on point. I think for a beginner as well, obviously there's a higher chance of injury if you don't know what you're doing. And so getting exercise execution down, I think, should be near the top of the list of priorities, so there's not unnecessary injuries happening. And then the next thing I would say is intensity, is bringing actual intensity to your training. and not, so, whether that be you learn about RPE, RIR, whatever, and you start to kind of see where you fall on that scale, or you just start, hey, like, what does failure feel? Let me actually like train to failure today and see what that feels like. And honestly, so if anyone's listening to this who has not intentionally trained to the point of like, I cannot physically do another rep. And here's a good place to do it, because not all exercises are conducive to this. Some are not safe to train to complete failure. Do it in the leg extension machine, okay? Leg extension machine, you're not gonna hurt yourself. And I want you to like go until like you cannot physically move the weight anymore. Yeah. And you're gonna be blown away. You're gonna think beforehand, yeah, okay, I'll get on here, I'm gonna do my 10 reps, and you're gonna finish and you'll have done like 20, And sure, like maybe they all won't be full range of motion, but you will have done so much more than you thought that you could do. And so that's the next one, is start bringing more intensity to your because that's really where the body composition change. Like that's so much of it is working close to failure. And then from that point, and again, I guess I didn't really insert this, but at this point, we're kind of assuming that you're doing a more weightlifting approach, right?
Yeah.
Looking at some of those smaller things that do still make a difference, but again, they're just not as important as consistency and effort, would be reps, rest, tempo, RPE. Those do make a difference, right?
Yep.
But they're at the bottom of the list for a reason.
Yeah. If I just sum up what you said, it's like, if you're really starting from square one, let's just get you consistent. Just show up to the gym. Even that's to start as you're just walking on the treadmill for 30 minutes because you're nervous. And like you said, explore the exercises, look at form. And then once you're getting all the basics down, intensity, all that, then looking at, like you said, tempo, rep range, all of those things too. I like what you said about doing something that's just going to, I forget exactly how you worded it, but you said like doing something that's just going to get you there, that's going to get you to the gym and starting there. Because I think a lot of people, we live in a society where everything just needs to be fast and just done it now. And so I think a lot of people want to do everything optimally as soon as possible. And it's like, if you could just slow down and do the big things that matter, you're going to make so much more progress early on than if you're trying to do all these things at once and then you don't even go to the gym in the first place. It's like that people say, like, I'd rather you be 80%, 100% of the time than 50%. No, 100%, 50% of the time. Right. So I was like, how does this analogy go? So for everyone that doesn't, I want you to clarify for beginners, you specified about, there's some exercises that aren't safe to be failing on, aren't conducive maybe to be failing on. How can if someone's like, okay, I heard what Ruth said, I'm going to go do the leg extension, but now maybe they want to do something upper body or a different one. What are some good ways to tell people this is a really good exercise for you to practice failure on? And these are ones I would probably stay away from for now.
Right. For someone who's more of a beginner, you're saying?
Yes, for a beginner. Yep. Someone who's just like, okay, I'm going to try failure for the first time today and they want to keep progressing. What are good exercises for them to pick to keep trying out failure and pushing for failure?
Yeah. So essentially anything where the hardest part of the exercise is is a very vulnerable position.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking like squats, right? That's a big one. You can fail safely in squats, but you have to be really good at setting up like the safety bars in the exact right position. You have to be right. And that's very possible. But again, for a brand new beginner, I'm not going to tell you go in the gym and go to complete failure in squats. It's just not going to happen.
Yep.
So kind of look at exercises that way. Where is the hardest part of the exercise? And then is that happening in a place where if I failed there, I would be in a very compromising position, right? Like I would fall over, the weight would fall on me or whatever the case may be. Right. And really beyond that, there's kind of this gray area too, where there's a large group of exercises that they maybe don't fit into that category. It's like you're not in a compromising position, if you will, in that hardest position. But they're not a stable exercise. And so you can compensate with other parts of your body. And so like you might not hurt yourself, but also like you're certainly not, so I'll use a bicep curl as an example, right? Going to failure in complete failure in a bicep curl, you're not going to, probably not going to hurt yourself, right? You're probably not. What's going to happen is when you start to reach complete failure, your shoulder is going to start assisting. And so now your elbow is going to start, you're going to see it move forward and back. And your shoulder is really you're going to see a lot of body language up there, right? Between the shoulder and the elbow. And you, at that point, like, you could keep doing that exercise, but is it really, you're not even fully using the bicep anymore. Yes, like the bicep is still working, but you're assisting now with other parts of the body.
Yeah.
And so again, looking at that, I think there's a differentiation to be made between technical failure and complete failure, right?
Yep.
Technical failure is when you can no longer do another rep with good form. And that's what I have my clients do.
Yeah.
There will be times where in a very stable environment, I will tell them to go to complete failure, like the leg extension example of like, even if you're not moving it completely.
Doing partials, basically.
Yes. Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. For those who don't know, when I say partials, like she's saying, you're doing leg extension, you're not getting full range of motion. You're just going partially full range of motion. Those are called partials. And so that's something like you're saying you do sometimes. So.
Right. Precisely. But if we're talking about technical failure, getting to technical failure, you can do that in, like, I would encourage people to try that in most of their exercises.
Yeah.
Except for, again, maybe a complete beginner, like maybe don't try that on squats just in case, right? Yeah. But then if we're talking complete failure, like you're getting to the point where you just like can't move the weight anymore, that choose machine exercises, choose exercises that are very stable, essentially. So hopefully that, I know that's a very nuanced answer. I feel like there's so many different.
No, that was great how you broke that down.
Helpful.
I think it's important for people to know, like, it depends. Like all of these questions that I'm asking you, there's a lot of it depends based on specific scenarios. So you gave a great insight to start here where you're going to fail is a vulnerable place. And then if you want to move on from there, okay, let's look for more stable exercises. So it's like if you're doing, like you said, a bicep curl, you could do like a preacher curl instead, where your arm is pressed against a pad. And that might be a better one. And then move into eventually when you realize, okay, don't move my shoulders, you'll be more set up to push to failure easier once you've gone through all those. So no, that was great. Let's move on then to advanced people. What would be, and again, it's going to be an it depends question because what does advanced mean? So maybe you could break this down in a couple parts of how you define advanced, but what would be the biggest advice that you give to people who have already been training? And I do want to make one clarification before we dive into this. I think a lot of people out there think they're advanced when they're not even implementing some of the basics that we've been talking about. Like maybe they've been working out for 3 years, but they're still not implementing intensity or anything like that. So I just want for anyone listening, just because you've lifted for a long time doesn't necessarily mean advanced. I'm talking more of people have tempo down, people, know good form. And this probably clarifies the question for you. It's more of like, the basics of what to do. To be lifting heavy. High rep ranges that make you toned, all of that stuff. So where would you advise people who are more advanced where they could really, a big piece of advice for them, or maybe where they could tailor their training a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. I know that it's tough with as you get more advanced into that advanced intermediate category, continuing to see progress is a big thing that I talk to people about a lot. Like, okay, I feel like I saw a lot of progress at first and now I'm stuck and I'm lifting, like I'm trying to lift heavy and, I'm doing progressive overload and I'm doing all these things. And I think, part of it, we have to just keep in mind, the gains will get slower the more advanced you get. And that's nothing we're going to work around. That's just fact, right? We have to just come to peace with that. Yeah. But if I could say a couple of things that I would recommend to continue to progress as a more advanced trainee. First, and this, like I'm just saying the same thing over and over, but I think it's really important.
It reiterates how important this is. So don't feel bad for that,
So keep training hard and close to failure. And so as you get more advanced, you get better at that, right? You get better at your muscle contractions. You get better at pushing harder in the gym. However, and listen, I speak from experience, like as a more advanced lifter, I know that it's very easy and oftentimes very tempting to just go in the gym and just go through the motions. Yeah. Go through the motions, like you're lifting heavy enough. It's, but you're not actually like pushing yourself the way you maybe should be in order to actually see more progress happen, or maybe even the way you were initially when you first found lifting or you first started out. So I would say that's something, don't fall into that. And maybe you will fall into that rut sometimes, but if you are in that rut, be able to recognize that and be like, you know what? I think I'm kind of just been showing up and I need to go in. I need to actually like push myself again. That's huge. Because again, intensity, like that's such a huge part of body composition change, and really seeing progress in the gym is bringing a high level of intensity to our training.
Yeah, I think that's a safe assumption that you made of people being advanced going through the motions, because that's kind of how life works in general, right? You work through your career, and some people want that, right? You want to work really hard in your career, get to a spot where you can kind of be just maintaining, kind of chilling. But if your goal is to continue to grow in training, you have to push yourself. And so as when you become more advanced, you kind of know all the things, you feel like you do. Like you said, it can be really easy to just be like, okay, I'm just going to lift enough. But it's actually, you could be training a lot harder. So I think that was a great point that you brought up.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is, again, so this works for anyone. Like anyone can do this, but it becomes more important for advanced trainees to continue to see progress, would be periodization, training periodization. And so essentially what that is kind of going through different phases of training with specific I'm telling the people this.
Yeah.
Going through different phases with a specific focus and emphasis. And so it's still all weightlifting, right? But maybe one phase is, very hypertrophy focused. Like the main stimulus you're getting is hypertrophy. Maybe another phase is a little bit more strength focused. Another one could be a little bit more metabolic. But some of the biggest benefits to doing this, and especially, like I said, anyone can do this, anyone can benefit from it, but especially people who are intermediate to advanced really, really do benefit being in that category. So you get better long-term recovery, right? So we talked about training really hard, which is important, but we need deloads. Like we know that too as trainers, right? Like there are some people who fall on that end where it's like they train too hard all of the time, or they do the same thing and they train really hard and they do that all of the time. And so essentially, like there's those diminishing returns. Eventually kind of the recovery is not where it needs to be in order to continue to progress. So that's one of the big benefits of periodization, is because every time you switch a training phase, it's a different stimulus, and it allows one energy system in your body to kind of recover as we're working on something else, right? So that's a really cool part of it. And so essentially with that, we can become more responsive to training, and especially for, again, people who tend to be more advanced. That would be something.
For someone advanced, I mean, one, they can just join your group training program and have that all done for them. But if someone does their own training, is there a general guideline you would give to someone to implementing more periodized stuff? I mean, one, implementing deloads, I guess, but all of that periodization that you do, I know you do metabolic training and all that. Mm-hmm. How would you, maybe a very basis level of how people could work that in? Or is that something pretty high level that a coach would be something that would help you more along the lines with?
I would highly recommend a coach.
Okay.
If you're someone who you love fitness, or you've been lifting for a while, and you're not someone who wants to take courses, and you're not someone who wants, sure, even if you love it, maybe you don't want to go to that extent of learning how to program, essentially.
Yeah.
The easiest is definitely going to be get into a program who does this. And from there, you could potentially even learn how to do it for yourself if you wanted to some extent. But the other thing is, and I think this is baseline, and if you're advanced and you're not doing this, and this is essentially the most basic form of periodization, if you will, is incorporate deloads. Yeah. Do some sort of deload. If you're doing some sort of deload, that's going to be so much better than not. You know what I mean? Like that's a huge part of it, honestly, is because, again, we talked about the biggest benefits is the recovery aspect, and being responsive to your training. Deloads, regardless of how you do them, because there's a lot of different ways to do deloads, will help you achieve that as well. So even if it's like every 8 weeks or 6 weeks even, or 10 or whatever, you're taking a week of, even if it's just like a volume deload where you're just not doing as much, or maybe it's an intensity deload where you're going in and you're not working to failure at all that week. That is going to be really helpful. And so I would say for someone who's doing their own programming, they're like, I want to optimize a little bit, but I really don't want to get into someone else's program for whatever reason, then I would say at the very least, make sure you're doing that, some level of deload. Yeah.
Cool. Did you have another point to add to the advance? Because I know I interrupted you and asked you to explain something. So
That's what I had for advanced. I could probably think of more, but I think
No, you're good.
don't overcomplicate things either, So yeah, I think those are good things to focus on.
Yeah, I think actually with you adding the overcomplicating, I think a lot of times it's just like there are a lot. You made this point earlier. There are a lot of people that I just see online, and they're doing like terrible form, terrible exercises. And again, you make a point of like, did they get there from genetics? A little help from things that we have nowadays, who knows?
Right.
But there are a lot of people that have a lot of muscle that don't optimize any of this. They don't focus on stuff. They just go to the gym, they work out really hard, and that's it. And they build a great foundation. So I think as I was taking the journey of being not so optimized focus, I was like, look, it is helpful. If I want quicker results, this is great to do. But like, one, there should still be a fun aspect to what I'm doing. I still should enjoy what I'm doing. And also, like, it's not the end of the world if everything's not perfectly optimized, because like you said, consistency, showing up, effort, which I would say effort with intensity is really going to be the biggest drivers. So.
Yes, totally. And I think like you touched on earlier too, like understanding the difference of what we're interested in and what like fires us up and gets us super into things versus the various stages that our clients are in. Well, yeah. And sometimes introducing some of that optimization without calling it that, and just kind of layering it on. We'll do so.
Totally. Cool. Awesome. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Do you want to let everyone know like where to find you, your programs, what your offers? Go ahead and just give everyone the details.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bree. This was so much fun. I've really been looking forward to it. I'm like, man, I'm so excited to talk with her in person.
I know, me too. Me too.
We've done DMs, even like voice messages and whatnot. But yeah, so it's been fun to have like a full on conversation. My problem is with podcasts is I'm like, I want to ask you stuff.
Well, this is just your sign that you have to start your own podcast sometime soon. And then, which I know you're so busy and there's so many things you're doing and,
No, actually.
I know you've desired to do it, so.
I know, I do. We'll see. That might be on the 2024 goals list, but I have not fully. It's committed. Just a matter of like what's most important. So yeah, it hasn't fully been decided yet. Anyways, yeah, you can find me at Ruth_Empower on Instagram. So that's MPOWER, Empower without the E. Same thing for my website, ruthempower.com. For coaching, so I have a group training program, as Bree said. We do weightlifting, hypertrophy based. It is periodized. It's wonderful. I love it. We've really developed I think the word that I found lately that just really resonated with me was warm. We've developed such a warm community of women too that, I just adore them. And they're so encouraging and they're so strong and they're so inspiring. Yeah. I had one client tell me the other day that she comes to my stories every day because I'll like repost when the members will post something about the group training program. They'll tag me. And so she comes to my stories every day to see how much someone else in our group lifted.
Oh my gosh.
Every day to see how much Sam lifted. And I'm like, I love that.
That's just so cute. I love that.
Yeah. So it's a great, I love it. So I do that group training. I do one-on-one nutrition coaching. My team is accepting some clients right now. I am full for one-on-one, but my assistant coach is taking some nutrition clients.
So exciting.
And then we have some fat loss and maintenance group coaching programs that will be running again in 2024, which is again, a lot of fun. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed this and loved it, screenshot it, share it on your stories. It's a free way to support the show. Make sure to tag both Ruth and I, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Damn Strong Podcast. Show me some love by leaving a review and sharing a screenshot of this episode on your Instagram stories. Until next time, stay strong.